Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I was going to check in on my nightcrawlers today. My nightcrawlers, I've only got 2 bins with nightcrawlers in them, and one of them is the European nightcrawlers. They're over there on the VERMIBAG Mini, and these nightcrawlers have been going for well over a year now, and it's been 11 days since I last fed that container, and I typically feed pretty generously, and I think last time I put a good amount of bedding in there too. I'm not worried that they're hungry, but I'm sure there's room for more food. And if you're like me, a lot of times you're feeding only because you're running out of room in your freezer, perhaps not because you think that your worms are hungry. And they'll handle it. They'll definitely break down whatever I give them. But after 11 days, I'm sure that they've probably done away with the majority of what they were given last time anyway. And then my other bin that's going to be checked in on today is my African nightcrawlers. They're in that little green tub right there. And you can see here on my list, they're 100 days old now. This bin has been in action for 100 days. And it's been a little bit longer now since the last time they were fed. It's been 24 days, so 3.5 weeks since they were last fed. And the whole reason for that was that I wanted that bin to start winding down. I was pretty much out of space in that container, and I wanted that bin to start winding down. So 24 days ago, the feeding that was given to that bin was kind of a material that I would normally not feed when I'm looking to see a bin reach the finish line. I actually put corn cobs in there, and if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that at least for me, corn cobs seem to take forever. However, in this case, I took the corn cobs and I had actually sliced them into little rings, and if I had just placed them in the corn cobs whole, they would probably be almost going nowhere by now. But after 24 days of having chopped them into little rings, I'm kind of hoping that they might be getting pretty close to being broken down. I also did notice that there was a sheet of paper placed on top of that container, and they've been steadily working their way through that piece of paper, and I believe that there's going to be virtually nothing of that paper left at this point. So we're just going to take a look in there, and if after 100 days it looks like they've actually depleted that last feeding they received 24 days ago, then it's going to be time to start trying to migrate the worms out of those finished castings and get things, lined up for a harvest in that container. So we're just going to start out by feeding the European nightcrawlers, and then we'll work our way over to checking on the African nightcrawlers. So let's get to work. So now for anybody that's new to my channel, this piece of cardboard here is covered in a powder that's known as diatomaceous earth. And it's material that's used as sort of a natural pesticide. It's not poison. It's actually tiny fossilized shards of microscopic life that lives in the ocean. It's intended to try to eliminate insects, and you may have seen a couple of flying insects in here. And fortunately, it seems like the matter is finally coming under control after quite a bit of time. I was trying to use the diatomaceous earth to try to eliminate some of the flying insects that have been making themselves at home in this container. And I'm not sure if it's the diatomaceous earth that's causing the reduction in these fruit flies or gnats or whatever they are, or what, but I'm just glad to see far fewer insects in here than I normally do. I had placed a good thick coating of leaves across the top, and I'm prepared to do so again today. Maybe that was really the trick. Maybe the trick was always to put the food down deep enough so that the flying insects are unable to access it, or maybe even sense it. So now these this is also another bin where I had fed these cut up corn cob pieces. So if you can imagine a piece of corn cob sliced into these little discs, this is what I had fed to this bin, as well as the other bin we're going to check in a moment, 24 days ago. So in this bin, this is a few feedings ago. This bin has received other fresh foods since these corn bits were placed in here. However, in the next bin that we're going to check in on, that was the last feeding applied to that container. So my hope is that in that container we're not going to see chunks like this remaining, although we might, so I really don't know what to expect. It was probably 11 days ago when we last fed this bin, was probably when we checked in on that bin last. And at that time, I believe there were still a fair number of corn bits like this. And at that time, I decided not to mess with them, kind of leave them as whole pieces so we can continue to observe the breakdown of this material in the bin. I'm not seeing many signs of other food items that we had placed in here other than the corn bits, although I just felt something. And these are items that are probably going to take far longer than those chunks of corn. This is the seed out of a mango. You can see that the worms have made themselves quite at home in there. I felt something else down here. Yep, okay. And this is the seed from a avocado. And I don't know if you ever felt one of these things, you would know that it's hard as a rock. However, it's been gradually softening up. Wow, that's pretty interesting. I don't think you'd ever be able to just stick your finger into an avocado seed like that while it's fresh out of the avocado. But I guess the time it's spent in here, in this bin, has done it some good, because it's finally starting to soften up. And I really didn't know what to expect from these. A buddy of mine handed me a few of them and said, hey, put these into your worm bin, let's see what happens. And I was skeptical. And it was quite a while ago, I must admit, but I'm finally starting to see some good progress on those. This is another mango seed, one that had actually been cut up into multiple pieces. You could see the clean cut pieces here. This was cut into 3 separate pieces. And it looks like they've actually eaten all of the seed itself that was within this husk. And they'll break this down too. But this is all material that takes quite a bit of time because it is tough. Here's another one that was, I guess, just cut in half. And I bet you there's worms hanging out in there too, but I'm not going to mess around with it too much. I just figured we'd open up the hole here a little bit and drop in today's feeding. And since I've got quite a generous feeding for them today, I want to make sure I've got a good sized hole into which we can place all the food, and then make sure that it's completely submerged under the surface. Because I don't want to have like an outbreak recurrence over here of flying insects coming back to feast on this food I'm putting in here today. So I'd like to make sure that I continue to place their feedings nice and low within the container. I'm trying to figure out what this might be. It seems this might be a mango skin, peelings of a mango. It's been quite a while since I fed in here, almost 2 weeks now, so I don't really recall what was given to them at that time. Another mango seed, as you can see. This one's pretty new though. It's still pretty tough. It's not really softening up much yet, so it does take time. This would be the end of one of the mangoes that was cut up. Always worms hanging out inside of it. A lot of times little baby worms like enjoying the outside of it. So I think we've probably got a large enough hole here to place the next feeding into. You could probably tell, just based on the size of the hole that I'm creating, that we're going to be giving them a plentiful amount. And the food that they're getting today is just apple peelings and potato peelings. So it's like some straight up sugary stuff, the fruity fructose type sugar that's going to be in the apple. And then I don't know what it's called, the starchy sugars that are in a potato. I don't think that's fructose, but it's also a starch, which is basically, chemically speaking, a sugar. So it's all stuff that I believe that the worms are probably going to do away with quite quickly. And that's always going to kind of distract them from these less appealing items, I guess. These corn discs, if you want to call them that. So I think that's a big enough hole. I'm going to drop in the food, but before we do, we'll just grab a handful of dry leaves to place down on the bottom underneath the food. A little bit of extra bedding never hurt, especially if you're giving them a lot of nitrogen-rich foods. I guess in the composting world, they're kind of considered as the greens, and this would be the browns, the more carbon-rich foods. And, well, I don't know if you could tell, but this is a fairly good amount of food over here. And let's go ahead and just dump it in. You can see we've almost completely filled up that hole. And you can see there's also a little bit of vegetable matter in here. I mean, it's mostly apple and potato. So I think before we start backfilling this hole, it would probably make good sense to put a little bit more bedding material in here. Try to keep it a little bit of a better balance than just all straight up nitrogen rich foods. And I'm not going to bother with the addition of grit. A lot of times you want to be adding grit with your worm feedings. And the grit is just there to help them digest their food. But in this case we're going to skip, because I do add grit pretty regularly, and this bin's been around for a while, as you saw earlier. So it's probably got plenty of grit just floating around throughout the bin already. So my assumption here is that the worms are probably okay from the perspective of grit. Although occasionally I will include it in their feedings, but this time we're just going to skip. And as we start backfilling the hole here, it's hard to remember where we had placed, handfuls of material that we pulled out that was still uncomposted food items. So it's still possible that we've got some food items right here on the surface. I'm not going to go crazy trying to locate them all to make sure that they're submerged below the surface. I'm going to apply a whole bunch of leafy matter right across the top as yet another barrier to try to help keep the food in this bin down below the surface, so that it doesn't become a draw for the flying insects. I guess I can probably throw in maybe 2 or 3 handfuls. There's a little bit remaining here in my box. I got stuff in here like sticks too. My leaf blower also serves as a vac, and it sucks up not only leaves but a lot of little sticks and stuff too, which would probably break down too in time. So it's really not the end of the world to have stuff like this in your bin, but sometimes I take larger chunks out like this. I think I'm going to remove that, but the rest can stay, that's fine. So the plastic I use in some of my bins at certain times to try to retain the moisture that would otherwise escape through evaporation. And it just seems to me like in the case of this bag it does a lot of good, because the material is nice and flaky and nice texture and nice moisture level all around. But in other bins, sometimes it just does too good of a job and keeps too much moisture in the bin. And at times I just remove it. So I've got some bins with plastic coverings, some not. But in this case I'm continuing to use it because it does seem to do a nice job. And even though we're not seeing a great deal of flying insects in here, I'm just going to keep this diatomaceous earth right here on top anyway. It's not doing anybody any harm. If it is in fact what's causing the reduction of the insect population in here, then I'm happy to just keep it in here as is. So, alright, that's the European nightcrawlers. They're all good to go now, fed after 11 days. Let's go check in on the African nightcrawlers. So now in the case of the African nightcrawlers here, if you did the math in your head already, 76 days is when this bin was last fed. And for a bin to only be aged 76 days before initiating the wind down of the bin, you're probably dealing with either a large population of worms eating the food very quickly, or just a small size container in which you have to stop feeding just because you've run out of space. And that's the case here. It was after 76 days that we decided that we didn't want to continue feeding in here because we were so close to being full in this container. And like I mentioned earlier, there was a piece of paper. You could see it right here. It was resting across the top of the surface. But at this point, it's nothing more than just a It's just a picture frame of what used to be there. It's just a scrap of paper anymore. It's certainly not a top covering. And that just means to me that the worms are coming up to eat this stuff, which might be a good sign. Maybe the food down underneath in the container itself has been depleted. So let's take a look in here and see what we've got. So right off the bat, you could see one of these rings of corn cob. And a little different looking here than in the other bin. In the other bin, it was still kind of a disc. Here it looks more like a donut, where the inside of it's been gobbled up already. That always seems to be the portion of a corn cob that the worms favor the most. You always see them gobbling up the insides of a piece of corn cob before they start into the outer portions of it. I don't know if it's because it's softer or more nutritious or better tasting or what the story is, but for whatever reason they always seem to favor that portion of the corn cob. Here's another one, similar deal. And last time we actually lined them all up so that they were all right there for us to see. And maybe we'll do the same here. Maybe we'll just start stacking them up as we encounter them. So I'm just going to start sliding things off to the side because last time we came in here to check, we didn't feed, but we did collect all these little bits of corn cob that we encountered last time too. We have placed them right down the middle to see if we can sort of create a concentrated feeding area with whatever remaining food bits we were able to stumble on while we were checking in on the bin. So as we make our way down through the middle, that's where we should start to see more and more worms. Let's see if we can get a look at what's happening down in the middle here. I can already see pieces of the corn cob here. There's a lot of castings on the inside, so it's kind of hard to tell if they've actually eaten out the insides of these already. My guess is that they probably have. Here's a case where the worms are still kind of in it, enjoying the inside of it. So it's going to require a little bit more time for this food to get broken down. Here we got a big worm digging their way through the center, side by side with a smaller worm. Sorry guys. But I think by cutting them up this way and increasing their surface area significantly, it's probably helping a lot with the breakdown of the material. But I'd really like to see this stuff gone already so we can get to the next phase of, trying to depopulate these castings, getting the worms to move out so we can collect all the castings and harvest this container. But as long as there's a food supply in here that they're still working on, they probably wouldn't respond much to the method I was planning to use to depopulate the castings. The method would be to, try to lure them out of the finished castings by setting up a fresh area of bedding and food for them. And then they'd be drawn to that because that would be the only game in town. But as long as there's still food in plentiful amounts within this container, then there's really not going to be a great deal of motivation for them to want to exit this stuff yet. If all they got to do is cruise around a little bit and find a nice piece of food like this, then they certainly wouldn't be motivated to go looking for a new place to feed. So it'll take a little bit more time here for this this food to get consumed. But I think we'll pile it all back into the middle again the way we did last time, so it's a little bit easier to locate. Last time I did sort of scatter things all over the place. Or maybe it was the time previous. Yeah, I think it was the time previous that I had scattered things quite a bit around. And it was only last week that I decided it would be kind of a good idea to try to refocus where the feedings are occurring, only so that we can get a better sense of how it's progressing next time we check in. If we can get a look at how all the food supply is holding up by having it all in one location, it'll just help us gauge the progress of this bin much more easily. But look at this material. Look at these castings. They are so beautiful. Such rich stuff. I think other than the corn-cob bits and a few pieces of this paper that were covering the top of the surface, there's really not a not a lot of anything else left in here. I guess the other sort of thing that you would normally see in my bins, since I use leaves as bedding, are these little sticks and stems of the leaves. And that's all food too, you know. As long as there's stuff like this in the bin, these worms are fine. They're going to just keep feeding on this stuff. I just wonder how much longer it's going to take. I've always got to be careful, because if I get a little bit sidetracked and I'm not paying attention, I could easily pour this material right over the edge, because I am pretty much at capacity in this container. So at this point, I think we've done a pretty good job rounding up what we could find of the corn cobs to get a sense of how they're progressing. And it does seem like quite a bit of food, though, if you look at it, right? I mean, makes me wonder how much longer it's going to take for this stuff to break down. Kind of makes me wonder if it was also a mistake to feed this type of a food item in a bin that I'd like to see finish sometime soon. Man, this material is so nice. It's so dark and rich in color, and the moisture level is just perfect everywhere. It does feel damp. It certainly feels damp when you touch it, but it all crumbles so readily. So I think we've got ourselves a pretty decent little ditch down here where we could put all these food bits right back down into. And then the next time we check in on this, I think we'll just be able to find all this stuff pretty easily again next time we check in. So I'm just going to lay it all right down the middle, and then we'll cover it back up. And we can take a look at what things look like over on this side a little bit too before we close up shop here. So yeah, that's quite a bit of food here. A couple other things are catching my eye now. Like I could see some a few worm cocoons here. I mean, they're pretty dark in color. So that means they're pretty far along in terms of, you know, when they're going to hatch. This one actually has kind of a brown, it's a little bit covered up in castings, but this nice dark color would suggest that it's ready to hatch pretty soon. So there, oops. Okay, I'm going to just lower this a little bit. I keep thinking I'm going to knock into it and send a lot of it off onto the table or off onto the floor, and that I don't want to have happen. So I think as we excavate here, we'll just move the material right on top of the feeding zone. Here and there I'm feeling a few more bits of the corn cob, because the stuff did get scattered all over the place at one point during one of our recent check-ins where I wasn't really trying so hard to keep everything in one place. But you could see how many worms come up when I lift up a handful of the material from this outer edge. And this outer edge is not even where the food was concentrated. The food was concentrated down the middle 11 days ago. So these worms are obviously finding plenty to eat in other places throughout the bin besides the middle. Every time I kind of stumble on another piece of larger food item, I just try to get it right back into the middle there, so that maybe on the outer edges we're left with kind of, you know, more casting material as opposed to food being scattered throughout the bin. So I'm just trying to level things off here a little bit. I like to leave my bins kind of level when I put them away. And there's so much nice material in this container. I'm beginning to think that maybe, even though we're a little bit cramped for room in here, maybe there is just enough room in here for us to even try to initiate the migration of the worms out of these finished castings right here in this container. That's one thing I've been thinking about lately, is how do I get that done? And I've actually thought about just dumping all of this stuff into a larger container so that I could set up what's called a horizontal migration. So that really just means you set up a fresh new area with all fresh bedding, fresh food. Then the worms, move out of the finished castings on their own. And maybe it wouldn't be set up using fresh food. Maybe it would just be using all of the food scraps that are in this material. So maybe next time I could just sort of pick all that stuff out, collect it, shove everything over, lay down a little bit of fresh bedding, and pile that stuff on the far edge. And then maybe we would actually start seeing the population of this container gravitate towards that other end of the bin, gradually evacuating the finished castings so that at some point we can actually relocate these worms into another fresh container, larger container next time, I believe, and harvest their castings out of here. So now, it doesn't really make a great deal of sense to spread this thing out as if it were still a complete piece of paper to cover the top with. But maybe I'll just place it here in the middle. Because the one thing that might be running a little bit low in this container is a carbon source as far as food goes. Because those corn-cob bits are what I would consider to be more of a nitrogen-rich food source. And as things start to wind down, they'll have that as a food source, a nitrogen-rich food source. But sometimes they need a little bit of a carbon food source too to balance things out. So they have a good combination of both. And that's the reason I think we've seen so much progress on this piece of paper too. Not to mention that it's a very thin piece of material, and especially when it gets damp under the plastic, it just makes for a much easier food item for them to consume. So that's where we stand with my nightcrawlers. It's always fun picking around in these bins because I'm so used to composting with red wigglers that checking in on my nightcrawlers is a little bit of a treat for me. So I always enjoy doing so, and granted I do spend a little bit more time than I probably need to. So hopefully I didn't lose you by this time. But we're done. That's it for today. I'm going to put these containers back up on the shelf and get things cleaned up here, but that's boring, so I won't waste your time with that. Let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching my video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. It's always very much appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. Ring the bell when you do. This way you'll get notified of new content coming online on my channel, so you can come over and check it out right away. All right, everyone. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day. Bye now.